Thank you very much for this invitation, first of all. I'm very grateful to have this great opportunity to meet lawyers. We are colleagues, basically. Lawyers who could be, are already, a certain number of them, essential actors in the anti-trafficking struggle. And I will say a few words about ideas for further thoughts and possibly further work in this field. But first of all, let me say a few words about my mandate. My mandate is one of the so-called special procedures of the Human Rights Council based in Geneva. Special procedures include special rapporteurs and working groups, collective bodies, but all of them share the essential feature of independence. So we are independent experts in charge of monitoring the situation of the protection of the rights in certain human rights area, in this case, trafficking in persons, especially women and children. We report to the Human Rights Council and to the General Assembly. So we submit 2 reports a year, one in Geneva and one in New York. These reports include the reports deriving from country visits. So I carry out country visits in individual countries where I have the opportunity to meet all the authorities in charge of anti-trafficking and related policy areas such as migration policies, labor market policies, social affairs, health, etc. And the report includes recommendations. So there is also follow-up in terms of implementation of the recommendations. The reports are, generally speaking, the reports to the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly are thematic reports in which I explore areas that have not been properly analyzed or where new approaches or new policies are needed. The last report I submitted to the General Assembly was about the implementation of the principle of the due diligence in the field of anti-trafficking. It was the first time that this was articulated in relation to trafficking persons. And this has been done in relation with violence against women, for example. But for trafficking, it is the first time. And it is important, of course, because this approach is an innovative approach, allowing us to interpret in an innovative way existing obligations and to identify obligations, especially on the private sector, which is not as such bound to international instruments. I would like to, first of all, since I'm aware that not all of you are familiar with the subject, to say a few words about what trafficking is nowadays and what are the dimensions of this phenomenon. I consider the ILO estimates the most reliable. These are conservative estimates, so because, you know, when a phenomenon is totally underground, it is always difficult to identify an appropriate methodology to evaluate the dimension. So ILO, with a methodology, used a methodology which is a conservative methodology, evaluates that there are about 20 million people in any moment subjected to forced labor and trafficking, assuming that there is a certain overlap of the two concepts. this dimension is already something that suggests that we have basically to switch from an idea of trafficking, a perception of trafficking we had in the past, as a sort of marginal phenomenon, very serious, but marginal, affecting limited areas, and basically mostly linked with sexual exploitation. These estimates show that the reality is completely different. At a global level, 22% of people subjected to trafficking and forced labor are in forced sexual exploitation, and 68% are in forced labor exploitation. Another stereotype that that comes from the past is that women are victimized in sexual exploitation and men are victimized in labor exploitation. This is not true, because women are also heavily victimized in labor exploitation, and the 55% globally of victims of trafficking and forced labor, including sexual exploitation and labor exploitation, are women and girls. So we can say that the majority of the victims of trafficking are still women and girls, disproportionately victimized in the field of sexual exploitation, but also in the field of labor exploitation. Another interesting aspect to be explored is the difference between estimates and data coming from official sources. Of course, there we have to be careful, because data coming from official sources do not really indicate what is the real dimension of a certain phenomenon, but rather indicate what is the level of activity of the state, of competent authorities to identify trafficking, because the reality is that you find trafficking only if you look for that. So certain apparent contradictions between data coming from official sources and estimates can be explained like this. This is not a measure. Official sources don't give a measure of the phenomenon, but of the efforts a state have done to identify and counteract trafficking. So paradoxically, if official data in a country are particularly high, this only means that that state has been particularly active in identifying and fighting against this phenomenon. In general terms, what is the state of play of the institutional response to trafficking? Unfortunately, I have to say that we cannot be happy with this data. Impunity prevails. We have data coming from official sources included in the global report of the UNODC, the agency in Vienna on crime prevention, of the UN on crime prevention. And we can see that in 15% of countries there are no convictions at all. In the 26% less than 10 convictions a year, and in another 26% between 10 and 50 convictions. You can understand that this is just a drop in the ocean compared to the estimated scale of the phenomenon. And if we look at assistance and protection of victims, still data are not, absolutely not comparable. We have to say, comparable with the real dimension, we have to say that still the vast majority of victims of trafficking are not identified as such. If they are identified, it can happen that the criminal proceedings here is not successful, it's not followed by a conviction for a number of reasons that you can understand very well, difficulty of proof, things that don't have anything to do with the rights of the person involved, but the person, after the criminal proceedings, since the vast majority of legislation establish a link between assistance to the victim and criminal proceedings, the person is supposed to be repatriated. And this is really something that we should keep in the loop as something that needs a big change in legislation and anti-trafficking regulation. What are the sectors that are particularly affected by trafficking? The sectors are all the sectors in which labor-intensive sectors, in which there is a systemic demand for cheap labor. But we have to think that these sectors are crucial sectors of the economy, such as agriculture, construction, domestic work, the touristic industry, fishing, electronics. So we can see that even sectors that are not at all sectors particularly affected by the economic crisis, but on the contrary, there are sectors that have very good perspectives, can be affected by the use of forced labor and trafficking. And what is the worrying trend is that in certain areas, trafficking is becoming a systemic component of the labor market. And this is particularly worrying because we know very well, and in Italy we know particularly well, and this derives from the experience of our struggle against organized crime, that in time this will disrupt the healthy side of the economy. Because of course the healthy enterprises cannot bear the competition of enterprises that don't pay the workforce. So from this point of view, we have to say that trafficking has been dealt with mostly in the context of criminal justice so far. But we have to slightly change our perception of the whole issue. This is, first of all, a gross violation of human rights. So first of all, the rights of the people victimized take first place. And it is also a big social and economic issue, which means that not only ministries of interior and justice must be involved in an anti-trafficking response, but also ministries dealing with economy and social affairs. Another aspect that I would like to highlight is that if this is the situation, if it is true that trafficking is becoming a systemic component of our societies, unfortunately, prevention is key. Prevention is key in the sense that every social actors have something to do, have a role to play in the anti-trafficking struggle. In different ways, we can say that every single individual person has a role to play as a consumer, as a buyer of goods, as an entrepreneur, as a lawyer, of course. But this should become a collective commitment. Of course, the protection of the rights of victims is at the core of my mandate, and this is the angle through which we have to look at the anti-trafficking struggle. First of all, victims' rights must be respected at all times. Unfortunately, I have to say that victims of trafficking are still, as I said, not recognized as victims, but even when they are recognized as victims, somehow their rights are not protected and not respected. It is also true, unfortunately, that anti-trafficking action itself can cause further violation of victims' rights. I give you an example. Maria Grazia has analyzed this phenomenon deeply. For example, in a number of countries, there are so-called closed shelters. This means that victims are placed in administrative detention because they are not free. They don't enjoy freedom of movement. And this is done in the name of their protection, ironically. But this is not the only problem. Victims, for example, in a number of cases are placed by their exploiters, by the traffickers, in a situation of exposure. The classical example that everybody knows is about women exploited in prostitution in charge of collecting money from the others. And of course, this is considered something that make them accomplices of exploiters. But this is not true. They are simply obliged to do so, compelled to do so. And unfortunately, we have a high number globally of women convicted as traffickers. Of course, I don't exclude that women can be traffickers, can become traffickers, can decide to exploit other women, but in a certain number of cases, it is simply the consequence of the fact that traffickers use victims to do a certain number of things that are particularly visible to the law enforcement authorities. And unfortunately, victims are very often treated as criminals and not as victims. Once a trafficking situation is detected, simply because they are prostitutes, and in certain countries prostitution itself is criminalized, and because they are very often irregular migrants. In fact, in certain areas of the world, and in Europe it is like this, trafficking is deeply linked with migration and now with conflicts, because we have realized that a significant number, probably the majority of people victimized in a trafficking process have also a background, a conflict background. In other words, people fleeing conflicts are in a situation of specific, particular social vulnerability, and they can easily fall prey to traffickers. So, for example, we know that many women coming from the Horn of Africa and crossing the desert and ending up in camps in Libya and then arriving in Italy have been already heavily exploited, sexually exploited, raped, and sexually exploited during the long and dangerous journey. What we can do? I think that the issue of the protection of victims' rights, as I said, is at the core of my mandate, has been dealt with mostly from the point of view of assistance and social integration. And in many countries, I have to say, there are shelters and programs for rehabilitation and reintegration of victims, mostly of victims of sexual exploitation, because this is the area that has been dealt with from the very beginning. In the vast majority of countries concerning labor exploitation, we are at the very beginning of the struggle, because we are now trying to figure out, we countries are trying to figure out how to deal with cases of labor exploitation. But there is one aspect that is still needs to be explored in practical terms about what we can do to ensure that victims have access to justice and remedies. And this can appear as something to taken for granted. Of course, a person subjected to exploitation has a right to back payment of salaries and compensation, but this is still on paper. No victim of trafficking receives real compensation for the damage suffered, be it economic damage or damage coming from the suffering, the situation of exploitation, as or healthcare violations of personal integrity or healthcare problems. And there, I think there is a lot to do. My mandate, my predecessor devoted one of the annual reports in 2011 on the right to an effective remedy for victims of trafficking. I will follow up, so one of my next reports will be devoted to this issue, just to understand what are the real obstacles, what is the reason why it is not so far. It is so difficult to ensure the effective enjoyment of a right that is already provided for in any international instrument on trafficking. But something we already know about this. For example, one aspect is that victims are not informed. They simply don't know that they can introduce, for example, in certain countries this is possible, can introduce a civil action in a criminal proceeding to have to claim compensation. So one of the issues is that in every situation in which a trafficked person can be identified, a case of trafficking can be detected, or a case of exploitation can be detected, because one point I always try to highlight is that if we want to address trafficking, we have to address a broader area of exploitation, because this is the only way to ensure that every exploited person finds a tailored solution for their personal situation, which includes, of course, the right to a remedy, including compensation, and the right to have a second chance, because, of course, what is the reason why people are not encouraged to come forward? When there is a labor check, the immediate consequence of this labor check is that irregular workers, irregular migrants are immediately expelled and deported, and maybe something else will happen, but those bearing negative consequences of this check are the workers. So there should be a policy in place allowing exploited workers to have another chance to find a gainful job, and of course, they should receive legal counseling. But this can be done even in the current situation. There is a campaign, probably tomorrow, Laura Boldrini, our president, will talk about that, which is called Lasciateci entrare, because in Italy, the center, the reception center, administrative detention centers for irregular migrants are called CIE, CIA. So there is a Lasciateci entrare, which means let us enter the centers, because it is crucial to ensure that people have the possibility of a friendly conversation with social workers, with someone that they can perceive it is on their side, and on this occasion to have also legal counseling about their situation, and this can be done with an effort, a collective effort to provide this kind of service. Secondly, I think that we need leading cases. We still need leading cases in the field of labor exploitation, because the reality is that there is there's no perception of the gravity of labor exploitation. This is considered just a minor violation of labor laws, but when a person is obliged to work 12 hours a day and live in inhuman, degrading conditions and have very little possibility to have good food or not at all. When a person, for example, is subjected to domestic servitude, cannot enjoy properly the sleep during the night, a continuous sleep during the night, because she has to be always at the disposal of the employer. When she I say she because in the vast majority of cases there are women to sleep on the floor and to eat leftovers. This has an impact, enormous, terrible impact on health, physical and psychological health. So labor exploitation is something that can really destroy the integrity and health of a person. And we have always to think that forced labor historically has been a form of torture. But this perception is not there. On the contrary, exploitation of migrant workers is something that is somehow normalized. So there are racist, discriminatory practices and discourse, a discriminatory discourse that justify, in many ways, justifies the fact that migrant workers receive lesser wages because it is already better than in their country. This is a very common, common sense discourse we hear every day. But there is no perception of the gravity of labor exploitation, and we need in this field, especially in this field, leading cases showing that in a certain number of cases, not always, but in a certain number of cases, first, intermediaries, criminal intermediaries, because this is very often the criminal segment of the recruitment and the placement in exploitative jobs is done by criminal groups, organized crime. We call this mafia, because it is true that the methods used by these criminal groups is based on intimidation, is based on violence, is based on the attempt, successful unfortunately, very often to obtain the silence of the person, what we call omertà, so the fact that the person does not report, does not denounce, and this method is exercised in relation to the victims and to the community, the immigration community, just to show that it is not possible to oppose, to say I don't want to do so. So intermediaries and recruiters, but also in certain cases employers. Employers in certain cases are well aware of what happens in their premises, in their fields. In the field of agriculture, for example, when people are forced to work in human conditions, we cannot think that the owners of the field don't know anything about how this performance is provided. But there is another area, and this is the criminal law area, but there is another area in which we need good practices, and the pro bono can do a lot in this field, to use all the resources, not only criminal law resources, but also civil law and labor law resources, to make it possible that exploited persons, among them probably there are also trafficked persons, but for good or bad reasons they are not recognized as such. So exploited person can get compensation for the work they have done and that has not been paid or properly paid. And again, we need to show that this is possible, this can be done, and this should be general commitment to use all the means we have at our disposal to make it possible that victims' rights are protected and respected. Thank you.